All right, let's try this again. This is now my third attempt at making this review. Seeing as the first time I tried to film it, my X-H2s decided to brick itself. I sent it off to Fuji to get repaired and I got it back. It worked for 5 days and then it died again. So I sent it off again and I just got it back. So it's been a month since I started this review, but you know what they say, third time's a charm, so let's get into it. The X-H2s is a great camera. It might be one of Fujifilm's best, but I won't be keeping it, and it's for one simple reason. But first, before we get into that, let's talk about some of the reasons why this is, probably, technically speaking at least, one of Fujifilm's best APS-C cameras. Also, be sure to subscribe to see more great photography content. So, the X-H2s is built really nicely. It feels great in the hand, and the build overall feels much better than the X-T5. The body is made of a solid magnesium alloy, it's entirely weather sealed, and I love the display up top as well. It really takes me back to the good old days of using my 5D Mark III. And while some reviewers consider it pointless, I rather like it. It's great to be able to glance down while at an event and see what settings you're on quickly and easily. Then again, with the dials of the X-T5, you can also do that, so it's not exactly something that is, groundbreaking. And one thing that is sadly missing from the X-T5 is the push-in function dials. So I'm unsure why this feature is absent, as its presence on the X-T5 makes for an awesome zoom in while manually focusing button. And the shutter button is actually one of the best I've tried on a Fuji camera. It has just the perfect amount of resistance, and Fuji actually advertised this in their marketing materials. I like it a lot more than the X-T5 shutter button, which can feel a little too hair triggery for me. The stacked image sensor though is definitely its biggest selling feature. But what exactly is a stacked sensor and why is it such a big deal? Well, unlike a traditional CMOS sensor, a stacked sensor has a much faster readout speed, which means you get much faster frames per second. And the X-H2s is actually capable of up to 40 frames per second shooting, but only up to 20 frames per second in RAW. You get better autofocus performance and most importantly, almost non-existent rolling shutter artifacts in video. Now, there are a handful of mirrorless cameras on the market at the moment with stacked sensors. The Nikon Z8 and Z9, the Sony A9 and the Canon R3, but if you go ahead and check out how much some of those cameras cost, they are all drastically more expensive than the X-H2s. With that said though, the X-H2s is not full frame, and its capabilities are certainly not as advanced as those other cameras, despite what some people might say, and yet it is also the most expensive Fujifilm crop sensor camera ever, coming in at around 4.2 thousand Australian dollars when not on sale. At the moment, it seems they sell for around 3.3 thousand, and I paid around $2,850 for mine, brand new during an end of financial year sale last year. That's also the cheapest I've ever seen it, ever, in terms of brand new at least. And I think at that price, it's a solid option, but at full retail, it's just way too expensive. But all right, how is the autofocus then? The stack sensor, in theory, should mean that the AF is blazing fast, right? Well, it's decent. In fact, I'd even say it's pretty damn good. With the latest firmware, which is firmware 6.00, it's certainly much quicker than the X-T5 is, especially in low light scenarios. Having used both in a dim nightclub, the X-H2s was much more confident at acquiring focus, especially when used with lenses that have linear motors in them, like the 18mm f1.4. And I also know as well that when shooting the drag shows that I shoot, using the 90mm f2, which is a very fast focusing lens in itself, absolutely no problem. When you have continuous AF turned on with eye tracking, it can track fast moving performance on a stage pretty well. But it will really boil down to the lens that you put on this camera. Anything with a linear motor in it, you'll be all right. But that being said, is it as quick or accurate as a Sony or even a Canon full frame? Well, it's not. It's close, but it's not quite there. And the high ISO performance too, while it is certainly decent, if I'm honest, I don't really see a drastic difference between it and the non-stacked yet much higher resolution of the X-T5. And I personally much prefer the images that come out of the X-T5. I think they're sharper, crisper, and I think that the grain at higher ISOs looks a little bit more film-like. It's definitely a bit better than the X-T5, but it's nothing to write home about. I would say, honestly, the absolute limits of this camera are probably like 6,400 ISO. I would not go any higher than that. Moving on to the battery life. So it uses the brand new W235 batteries, which are really, like, in the X-T5, they're absolutely amazing. In the X-H2s, they're not quite as good. I don't know if this top display is using too much power or something, but I noticed that I could get maybe 500 to 600 shots per charge with the X-H2s, whereas the X-T5, I was pushing well over 1,000 shots per charge at some points. And all of those things could be things that you could excuse if the X-H2s was similar price to the X-T5, but this thing is as expensive, not even almost, this thing is as expensive as like a Sony a7 IV or like many other full frame mirrorless options on the market. And speaking of the a7 IV, I recently tried to shoot with one, and it was actually my sort of first proper attempt at doing a shoot with a Sony. And definitely be sure to check that video out. It's definitely a fun one. But while I hated the ergonomics and the weird shutter sound of that camera, the autofocus and the high ISO performance really put things into perspective for me when it comes to this review and discussing the value of the X-H2s as a camera for professionals. See, Fuji clearly expects people to see that it competes with full frame flagship options, and it prices it as such, but unfortunately, I just don't quite think it's there yet. The camera feels overall a little underbaked, and that's a shame because there are so many great things about this camera that I do genuinely love. For example, the video quality. So thanks to the X-H2s, I started this YouTube channel, and all of my videos up until this one have been filmed with it, except for the last few that I also used my X-T5 for while my X-H2s was away at Fuji being repaired. And the video quality is just amazing. I mean, F-Log2 is awesome to grade, even if the base 1250 ISO means that you do need to use a variable ND filter during the day, but you get 6.2K open gate, 10-bit ProRes recording internally to these super fast CFExpress Type B cards. It's an absolute dream if you use it. And I personally never really shot with ProRes because the file sizes are just gigantic and they just weren't really necessary for the kind of work that I was doing, but it is awesome that it can do it. And I won't lie, having these cards in here it's just like, it really spoils you because then you go back to using like the X-T5 with the SD cards and transferring photos, especially the high resolution ones, just takes ages. So I love the CFExpress Type B cards. They are expensive, but the benefits over SD are definitely there. But the video autofocus, it's just average at best. I mean, look, yes, with the 16-55 2.8, it becomes usable, probably because that lens is like their flagship video lens, but it is a far cry off the industry standard, which is, say, a Sony. And with regards to the IBIS, well, you definitely won't be hand holding it if you want to use it as a vlogging camera because it's really not that great. For taking photos, it's not too bad because you do, I did notice I was getting basically hand holdable images at around 1/10 to 1/15 of a second, but yeah, for video, you really need a gimbal or something in order to get a good, smooth image. I personally was not very impressed with the IBIS in the X-H2s. But a few places where it's definitely better than the Sony is the menu system. So everything is fairly logically laid out, and I love how you can easily set custom modes, and you have plenty of them on the top dial as well. So you get basically 7 custom modes on the top dial, and you can change them so you can have them all be either photo or video. And another thing I love as well is you can set it so they auto update. So every time you change a setting, like say you're like, oh, I want to do this, do that, you don't have to save it again. It automatically saves it and automatically remembers it, which is really, really awesome. And I haven't seen any other cameras that do that. One thing that I do miss from my Canon is the fact that it doesn't have a full touchscreen menu system. That would have been really nice because it does have a touchscreen, but the menu system doesn't work with touch, which is a shame. But the EVF, I mean, I think it's one of the best on the market. It's noticeably better than the X-T5. It's so sharp and it has such a great 240 frames per second refresh rate that it's just a joy to look through and use. But the X-H2 also shares that same EVF. So we have a photo camera, which isn't as high resolution as the X-T5, and a video camera, which is definitely a step up from the X-T5, but not by a long shot. I mean, both cameras also shoot F-Log2. As I found, they both performed fairly similar in video, minus the rolling shutter and the slightly better, yet still not great autofocus performance. And look, I guess the flip screen is much better for video, but the X-H2 has that screen as well. So who is this camera for then? Well, I don't know. The X-H2 also exists, and that is the camera that I probably should have bought instead. It shares the same amazing 40 megapixel sensor of the X-T5, but also the beautiful build quality of the X-H2s and the power of those really fast CFExpress cards. I mean, it literally looks identical to the X-H2s, just without this little S on the front. In fact, they're so similar that when Fujifilm sent me a replacement camera, they accidentally sent me an X-H2 instead of an S. And to Fuji's credit, they did tell me that it was a picking error, and they did send me out an X-H2s express post straight away, but still, it's a pretty funny mistake. Oh, and like the X-H2 is like at least $500 cheaper usually as well. So unless you can get the X-H2s on sale where the price difference between them isn't so big, and you really want the best possible Fujifilm video experience, then maybe it makes some sense. Otherwise, just get an X-H2 or an X-T5, or buy something full frame if you want a better hybrid experience. Now, if you saw my video about why I switched from Canon to Fujifilm, I explained that while I was aware that technically speaking, the full frame Canon was the superior camera, I switched because I felt like the R6 felt very soulless to shoot with, whereas the Fuji was fun and really made me want to go out and take photos. And the truth is that while the X-T5 is certainly the camera that makes me want to go out there and shoot, the X-H2s with its PASM layout, at the end of the day, it just feels like a tool to get work done. And if we're talking about a tool for professional work, breaking 3 times in 9 months is a pretty piss poor performance, honestly. This brings me onto the main reason why I'll be selling this camera. It all boils down to reliability. So in 9 months of owning this camera, I've had it fail 3 times. And I don't mean just like glitch, I mean, it's had to either be replaced or sent back to Fuji. This is now my 3rd body in 9 months. Once 2 weeks after buying it, when the video footage was unusable due to weird artifacts probably caused by some sort of mainboard malfunction, and recently again this time around, the camera refused to power on unless you plugged a power cable into it for about half an hour. It would turn on, work for about 15 minutes, and then die, where no matter what you did with the on-off switch, the top display would show you some information, and you could hear the IBIS engaging if you sort of held it to your ear. I'll include a clip just so you can see what I'm talking about here. Yeah, there was absolutely nothing on the top screen other than just like the default sort of off display. So it was reading the cards. You could tell like it was on, but it was not on. Like the screen, both screens, the EVF and the actual back display were turned off. And this top display didn't change at all, whether you turn it on or off. You know, I tried taking the battery out. I tried swapping the battery with the X-T5 battery. I used this battery in the X-T5, it worked just fine. So nothing fixed it. And then, so I sent it off. They fixed it, where they apparently reprogrammed the PCB. That's what it said on the little service receipt. It worked for a grand total of 5 days. And then right before I boarded a flight to Queensland last week, decided to die again. Yeah, the same exact issue had happened. This time around, I was like, you need to send me a replacement camera because there's obviously something fundamentally wrong with our camera. And they did. They sent me a brand new replacement camera right after this. And just to clarify as well, I used only first-party batteries during the duration of my use with this camera. And these are just the camera breaking bugs that I experienced. I also experienced glitches during my 9 months of heavy use. The X-H2s frequently crashed, especially during high-speed AFC bursts that required pulling the battery out. And also occasionally during filming. In custom modes, the aperture value would freeze and it would require me to delete said custom mode entirely and recreate it to fix it, which is pretty frustrating, especially when you're in the middle of a shoot. And I'm sorry, but for a professional flagship body, that is completely unacceptable. Perhaps I got unlucky. Perhaps I just got stuck with lemons of cameras. And if I tried my luck again, I'll get a camera that actually works properly. But as a tool which I need to rely on for paid work, I just can't trust the X-H2s. In fact, this is honestly, I've never had a piece of electronics break this much in such a short period of time. And it's really unusual because I've got a plethora of Fujifilm gear. In my last video, I call myself a Fuji fanboy for God's sake, and I've never had any issues with any of it. None of my lenses, none of my other cameras, they all work great and I absolutely adore them for photography. But either I just had the worst streak of luck with the X-H2s or I don't know, but it has left me with a very sour taste in my mouth and I'm not impressed. And I'm sure that over time they'll continue to improve it and make it even better. So I know that certain glitches and bugs were ironed out with each new firmware update. And the autofocus definitely has improved a lot since buying it. So I know there was a lot of people online complaining about what like absolutely atrocious AF performance this camera had when it first came out. And It's definitely the best it's ever been, but it is still nowhere close to full frame level, sadly. With that said, it's a shame because this camera, when it works, is really, really good. It has its quirks and its downsides, but ultimately at the end of the day, it is really well built. The EVF is magic and it has the best autofocus of any Fujifilm camera ever made up until this point. But at the price that it is and the market position that it's trying to dominate, I just don't see why you would buy this over a full frame mirrorless hybrid option like an A7 IV or a Lumix S5 II instead. And if you just want a Fuji for the photography benefits, which there are plenty of, buy the X-H2 or the X-T5 instead and use that money that you save buying a lens or two. And look, I know I've been fairly negative in this review, and I'd like to reiterate that I'm not entirely switching systems or getting rid of all of my Fuji gear. I still intend to keep my X-T5 and will likely buy an X-H2 sometime down the road, because in terms of photography, Fujifilm is still the king for me. But when it comes to a camera, which I can use and rely on for video and event work, the X-H2s just wasn't cutting it for me, so it's getting sold. In fact, I've actually recorded this entire video with its replacement. Can you guess what it is? I'll give you a hint. It's not a Sony. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.